upon a time there was a tavern where we used to raise a glass or two. Remember how we laughed away the hours. Think of all the great things we would do. Those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we'd choose. We'd fight and never lose. We were young and sure to have our way. Then the busy years went rushing by us. We lost our starry notions on the way. If by chance I'd see you in the tavern, we'd smile at one another and we'd say, those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we'd choose. We'd fight and never lose. Those were the days, oh yes, those were the days. Just tonight I stood before the tavern. Nothing seemed the way it used to be. In the glass I saw a strange reflection. Was that lonely woman really me? Those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we'd choose. We'd fight and never lose. Those were the days, oh yes, those were the days. Through the door there came familiar laughter. I saw your face and heard you call my name. Oh, my friend, we're older, but no wiser. For in our hearts the dreams are still the same. Those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we'd choose. We'd fight and never lose. Those were the days, oh yes, those were the days.
Well, it's just a few minutes before lunch. Wayne, should we go ahead and kind of do our once around the room thing?
That, I'll get the guy started.
So here's the idea of it. Again, this crowd's so anarchical, they may not go with the idea, but here's the notion. After lunch, after we get a chance to go around the room once, will be the time for people to volunteer with anecdotes and stories that are either serious but hopefully not interesting and entertaining. But what we'd like to do now, I was thinking, was very quickly go around the room, 2 or 3 sentences about what you have been doing since you left, to sort of bring us up to date. Is everybody comfortable with that as an idea? Okay, let's start right here at this table, and then we'll move around that way.
Right here. You have to
Is there
speak
gonna
up
be a mic?
properly, huh?
Stand up.
Yeah, just stand up. I don't think you need the mic.
So, I'm Beth Irons. I was in the urban and transportation subgroup of Voorhees. And I went on to law school and became a real estate lawyer, and then I worked for Marriott, the hotel company. And then I did a lot of other things since then, but right now I do real estate. I'm a real estate broker, and I do that part-time. So I've had a very interesting career.
I'm Bill Harold. I stayed with PRC until 1988, long after any trace of Voorhees had been eliminated from the letterhead. But I switched fields in the mid-'80s and became interested in information technology. Went on to become a partner in Ernst & Young and did IT consulting for the rest of my career, including then I went over to my last client and I was the vice president of Coca-Cola Company for several years in the late 90s. So since then, been in Annapolis and recently retired. So that's what I'm doing.
What are you doing now, Bill?
I sail when I can, and I'm learning to play the guitar.
You don't have a bird shop anymore?
No, we don't have the shop anymore. I had a late life career in retailing, owning and operating the Wild Bird Center in Annapolis, which is all about birds and bird feeding and bird houses and
It's interesting.
crap to put in your yard. And so we sold that. We sold that, thank God, in 2011. And so since then, it's been mostly retirement. Thank you.
I'm Marcia Goldberg. I was in the Planning and Urban and Transportation Group, I guess it was called, and eventually it became PEI. And from Voorhees, I went to the Department of Energy. At DOE, I had contractors writing them, so I was having to read them, which was like hell. And from there, I went to Argonne National Laboratory. They have an office in Washington, and I did environmental impact assessments there. And then I shifted, I got a AAAS fellowship, and I moved on to the State Department, doing environmental impact assessments again in their Office of Environment. And then to Millennium Challenge Corporation, where I worked in the area of environment for their development projects. And now I'm part of a public-private partnership that's called GeoSummer, and we do geoinformation for sustainable urban management and resilience, which is mapping. So I've sort of gotten back to where Voorhees started, I guess, and we train people to use GIS and GPS and technologies to do urban map layers, which is going back to Ian McCard, which was my early training, and help them learn to manage their systems. And we do workshops, and so far we work mostly in developing countries, but we're also looking to team with the Rockefeller 100 Cities program and do some work domestically as well.
I'm Steve Lockwood. In the, I guess it was the late 70s, I kind of segued away from the Voorhees part of what was then PRC into the Frederick R. Harris part. I was in Malaysia for a couple of years doing some new town development and offshore oil platform planning, an area of expertise of mine that I picked up in a couple of weeks in Malaysia. I got scared of being out of the U.S. for so long, and I came back. I left PRC, went on my own for a couple of years to do some expressway work, and then realized that that being on my own was, while I made a lot of money, wasn't a lot much fun working in my kitchen. I was drafted. I was became a political appointee. I was a political appointee at FHWA as a head of policy for 4 years, and I left. During which time I got interested in what was called, TSMO, Transportation Management Systems Operations, ITS, and all of that stuff. And I left FHWA and went to Parsons Brinkerhoff, actually working with Phil and Roy mostly in the Fairdyne group in that area for some time, and stayed with PB working in that arena consistently for 20 years or so. And I'm still working maybe half to two-thirds times, mostly in what you might call management consulting to state DOTs about how to better operate their systems. And when I'm not doing that kind of consulting around the country, it's basically for states around the country, I'm either sailing or traveling with Ellen one place or another. Okay, you guys next?
How about here? Dave?
Excuse me, I'm Dave Hensing.
You want to just hold that?
Sure.
And then just pass it on to the next person, that way I
It's
get a
being
record.
recorded?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm Dave Hensing. I left AMV in 1980 and joined a management consulting firm, small consulting firm. Can you hear me? Let me have a mic. I don't have a good.
It's kind of stuck. You have to come up here.
Oh, come on.
There you go.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. I have a terrible speaking voice, particularly at night. I left the firm around 1980 and spent about a year or so with a management consulting firm by the name of Berkshire Associates, during which time I became intimately familiar with the states of Mississippi and Virginia. Went to every district office in those two states and made presentations and so forth. I joined Ashdown and was there for a little over 20 years as the deputy director of Frank Francois. Many of you know him. And after that, let's see, what did I do? I became the acting, kind of sort of a stand-in president of ITS America for about a year. And then hooked up with SAIC to do a little bit more consulting and partnered with Wayne on a project or two during that time. And that's kind of, I've been retired now for 10 years or so.
I'm not going to talk about history. I have to violate the plan and talk about Al for a moment because I'm not sure I'm going to be here this afternoon. One of the last time I did spend with Al, he called and invited me to go out to the National Archives, to the mapping center. Turns out he had been a great benefactor to the National Archives, and so they knew him very well. And what we went to look at was, this was the getting ready for the 50th anniversary, the 40th anniversary, sorry, the interstate, and they had the maps that Roosevelt had marked, they had the maps that had been developed, and they were showing them to Al, and I got to hold them in my hands. But the important thing that day, which knocked me over, just as Tom said, they presented Al with aerial photographs of the beaches that he had invaded in the World War II. Nancy, I have no idea whether the family still has those, but this was just a couple of weeks before Al passed away. But somebody ought to know where those are and find them. We can talk to the National Archives because obviously they had immense respect for his collection of maps and his support for the Library of Congress and so forth. This was out at the Maryland Archives.
I am Phil Tarnoff, joined Voorhees in the late 70s and left in '84 during the days when PRC was exercising its muscle over the future of Voorhees. And in fact, Don Capel was the one who hired me. He was sober at the time. I think he was sober. And we actually got to be great friends. Anyway, after leaving Voorhees, I started a company called Paradigm Systems, Inc., which several people here ultimately became the employees of. Steve, I never sure whether you were an employee or an associate or just used our space. And Paradigm then was purchased by Parsons Brinckerhoff and became PV Paradigm, and grew to about 200 people by the time we sold it in the 90s, in the mid-90s. After becoming part of Parsons Brinckerhoff, I decided that was not the life that I wanted to lead. And I left PV and joined the University of Maryland, where I began a center called the Center for Advanced Transportation Technology, which became the largest center on the campus in College Park. And now I've left the university and I'm sort of retired, mostly retired. I'm asymptotically approaching retirement. And I do a little work mostly with something called the Operations Academy, which is a 2-week program that we give every fall. And we've run about over 350 people through there to teach people, as Steve said, what this mysterious acronym TSMO, Transportation Systems Management and Operations, really means. And since that time, I've written a book, a couple books actually, and spend the rest of my time entertaining Nancy.
Ralph Gockenheimer. My wife is a practical woman who recently straightened out the course for the announcements. Since retirement, I do a lot of reading, and I'm reading a book that I recommend highly to everybody in the room. It's called Time, a User's Source, and it's written by a social psychologist first in German. It's a very interesting and useful book for people who have a little time on their hands and other things. I was engaged by AMV usually where they needed somebody who could speak Spanish and tumble along in Portuguese, and as a result I got to interview all of the department heads of the Ministry of Transportation of Venezuela in the summer of 1975. And it was a wonderful summer for me. I would have my appointments and then go write them up at a bar or something in my new electric typewriter, and people were always much thinking about Venezuela lately. So unusual, I can't understand it. I walked into an office and the guy, I was always wondering how much do they know about people who are asking questions here. And he looked at me and said, "Welcome, Professor." And I said, "Oh." And he said, "I know you're here to close us down, but I want to say first, I think we're doing a useful job for the ministry. Wait just a moment. How do you know I'm here to put you to close you down?" And he said, "Well, you're from the Institute of Technology, right?" And I said, "Yeah, it's School of Architecture and Planning." He said, "Oh."
I'm T.R. Lakshmanan. Everybody knows me as Laksh. I was employed when Al Voorhees came to Ohio State for a seminar, and he and I argued. Next morning he calls me and says, "Couldn't you come work for me? Summer will prove me wrong," he said. So I came for a summer job, but stayed on for 5 years. And so Hal has been a very important part of my life, not only working there, and I subsequently went off to places like Kansas Research Corporation, Johns Hopkins University, and Boston University, and later for the Bureau of Transportation Risk as a director. In all of these places, Al had been in contact with me, as I will be able to say a little more clearly later on when we get a chance to emphasize that. I just want to say that I'm not an engineer. My undergraduate is in physics, my master's is in meteorology, and I was PhD in economic geography. So, but I grew a lot in the sea of engineers, in Voorhees and others. And Voorhees is a very important influence on me, which I'll talk about later.
I'm Bob Skinner. The 1971 to 1983 was my time at AMV. Worked for Dave Henson right off the bat for a long time, and then worked with him for really the bulk of my career while he was at AASHTO. I followed Tom Dean to TRB when TRB started doing so-called policy studies. Then followed Tom as executive director of TRB for 20 years and retired in 2015. And now, sort of, I'm retired, but I seem to have a number of volunteer things, and I'm sitting on a couple of small consulting firm boards. So that's it.
I'm Mary Gannett. I recognize most of you, and not all of you. And I am retired, and I am at home, and I am just watching my grandchildren. That's about all I do. So that's, and I enjoy seeing everyone here. Thank you.
That's one of the best things you could be doing, is watching your grandchildren.
That's right.
Ken Kidd. I joined the Voorhees group in the late 70s hired by Phil Tarnoff. I was coming up from Petersburg, Virginia, and Phil told me that they were getting ready to start a systems group within Voorhees, and if I could wait for a couple of months, that he would have a job for me. So I waited, finally called him and says, well, we finally got the approval, so I was hired. I think it was fall of 77 or 78, I'm not sure which one of the years it was. And since then, as organizational changes took place, Frederick R. Harris, AECOM, and so forth, and then I left that organization to join H&TB and Wilbur Smith, and now I'm retired and just living a happy life.
That's great. What more could you want?
Good afternoon, all. I'm Steve Shapiro. I joined in 77 and was there through about 84 at the old Springhouse Road location, which is now a parking lot. They paved Paradise and put up a parking lot, unfortunately. One of my goals in life, in fact, my only goal in my professional life, was to do interesting work. And I bless the organization that I was part of here because it provided me with interesting work. I was originally brought down for an interview, and Don Capel and got me there for the interview along with Phil, and they took me out to lunch, and gee, this was a group of really bright people that I wanted to be part of, but I was in the middle of a project, and I said, gee, I'd really like to join, but I've got this other thing that's almost wrapped up in New York. Thanks very much for inviting me down, but I can't join right now. Lo and behold, a couple of months later, they made me another offer, and the other project finished. And so I was able to come down and join the group. And we were doing studies of traffic, and this was really interesting to me. And my career evolved, but I could never quite pull away from the traffic side or from the Voorhees, the PRC Voorhees group. I left, joined another firm, and then several years later, the group in Florida that was then Frederick R. Harris said, hey, we've got this interesting real-world project. Hey, I can really enjoy a real-world project that we're doing down in Florida. So I left to join that group and was part of the reconstruction of I-95, did some interesting work with Service Patrol and MOT, and evaluating different benefits that could go on during reconstruction, and that was really great. Left again after a couple of years when the work was no longer interesting, and then got rehired by, what were we then, Dim Jim Harris back in Virginia. So I spent kind of 3 iterations with what the Voorhees group evolved into, and it always was interesting work. I finished off my career with Dewberry Organization, one of the other stalwarts of development in Northern Virginia, and finished it doing intelligent transportation systems, which was kind of what I had geared my career to all along. And I thank this group for getting me started in doing interesting work and having a career that evolved doing interesting work. Right now, my wife and I travel whenever we can, and I do volunteer work in the community.
John Callow, let's see, I started out with Tom Dean playing in the Metro as an intern from college. Then I shifted over to Voorhees and still was an intern at 63. The explosion that occurred June of 64 when our industry took off, so I hadn't even intended to be in this kind of business. I had 3 interviews and job offers with the government, whatever. But Al took me to coffee one morning and said, "How much have you got offered?" And I said, "Well, my highest is $6,700 a year." He said, "I'll give you 68." And with that, with another $100, he sold me his car.
So you could be bought for $100.
Anyway, then I was in '84 working with Phil Tarnoff, left and created Callow Associates Incorporated. '92, I sold that to SAIC. Didn't quite like that environment. We created Callow Transportation. That was bought out by an engineering firm, Pat and Harris Rustin Associates. So I became a partner and board of director member. But then the last AMV reunion, 2009, I had a whisper in my ear. In 2010, I joined Kittleson Associates. And I've been there ever since, still doing exactly what I've always do, which Tom Dean talked me into doing, working with a guy by the name of Till Hazel, who happened to develop this project and a few others around here. And I've loved everything I do ever since. Dinah and I bought a farm out in Orlean, Virginia, 1996, so that's home, just past Warrenton.
Let me get this out of the way and then I can go eat. Looking around, I think I may be the only person in the room who's actually fired from AMV. But,
I remember.
okay. But yes, I'm sure you do. Did you get your wall fixed? But I've forgiven them because it probably turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. If it hadn't, I probably would have spent the rest of my career just working for somebody else. As it was, I went off on my own, worked a couple years by myself. Started a little company with Mark Gollenberg, who was another ex-AMV person out of the Boston office. And we grew, we kept that firm going for, or at least I kept it going for 25 years. And learned all the issues about cash flow that Tom was talking about earlier. Ended up merging with Palomo McGee, another spin-off from AMV, and 2 years later we were bought by Van Ness Hangen, which is another spin-off from AMV. It all stays together. And finally, about 5 years ago, I retired for good. I thought I was going to do some more working, but I discovered that I'm actually over the lump on the Laffer curve, and it's true, when you reach a certain point, it really isn't worth working anymore, so I don't. If anybody wants me as a consultant, I don't take salary, but just feed me at 4-star restaurants, put me up at 4-star hotels. It's all expensed and it's not taxable. I'll take it. And that's what I'm doing these days. I'm retired, I do some stuff at TRB, serve on some panels, and I go visit grandchildren.
Thanks, Wayne. I'm Joel Leash. I was with AMV from 1968 to 71. Started out in McLean. Moved to Seattle early in 71, working with Keith Gilbert. And in 71, I had a phone call from my father, Jack Leash. Some of you actually were students of his, who had just started the firm. And he called me, and like the Godfather, made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So we worked together, built the firm. I'm not sure you can call it a spin-off of AMV, but until his death in 1991. And since then, I've primarily just been working on my own, consulting essentially all over the world, all over the United States, teaching, and maybe later I can tell a Russia story. So right now I'm still doing a little bit of work, doing some lecturing still, active in TRB, and playing lots of golf, lots of tennis, and fishing. So.
Well, I'm Dick Pratt, and I was hired. Really, I was hired by Joe Schofer, who was getting his doctor's degree at the same time as I was getting my master's degree at Northwestern. And the hiring was made effective in 1965. So I got to AMV a year after Tom, and after a few days of not really knowing what I was doing and a few odd tasks with Joe, I started working with Tom, which we can talk more about later, but in case I don't get the chance, I just want to say that Tom Dean, among the mentors that I had professionally, was number one, no question about that. I went out on my own in '69, shortly joined by the late Gordon Schultz, and went through 3 different consulting arrangements. One of the big projects I've done is the Travel Response to Transportation System Changes Handbook, which is 3 editions, but I think of it as RHPA, RHPB, and RHPC. RHPA being Richard H. Pratt and Associates, because Gordon was never willing to put his name on the masthead. RHPB when after we moved over to Barton Ashman, and RHPC, Richard H. Pratt Consultant, Inc. What do I do now? Well, a lot of time is spent, since we live in a 2-story house, going from the 1st floor to the 2nd floor to get the thing that I went up to get 2 minutes previously, but forgot what it was by the time I got up there. We also have great children and grandchildren spread from Washington State to New Jersey we have to keep track of. And in the town of Garrett Park, well, for the last 4 years or so, I've been trying to make sure that the devil in the details are all taken care of in our Safe Routes to School sidewalk project. And I'm quite confident that Peggy is not going to wish to stand up and say anything, but you should know that she was the first Lady Mayor of Garrett Park, Maryland.
Good. Steve Anderley. In 1975, Dave Hensing made a recruiting trip to the University of Iowa. I don't know if he remembers that or not. About 10 of us interviewed, and I, being somewhat of a smart, you know what, in those days, Dave asked me what I'd do if I inherited $1 million. And I said, I'd start a consulting firm and compete with you. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call, and the rest is somewhat history. So I worked with, primarily within Dave's group, with Bob Skinner, Jim Watt, and John Callow. I remember my first business trip as a professional was with John Callow to San Juan. And I think I asked for French dressing on my Caesar salad. So I was getting used to this world. But I worked for Voorhees from '75 to '79, and then a dozen years with Frank Spielberg at SG Associates. Went to TRB in '92. '99, I went to the University, or Iowa State University, the Center for Transportation Research and Education. Came back to TRB in 2006 to work on the Sharp 2 program, and I'm still there running committees and the Sharp 2 naturalistic driving database. So that's the career, and it's been a wonderful one, and it was really launched by AMV, so thank you.
Richard Casey, contrast guy that nobody knew. Mary hired me And I think really when Mary hired me, she hired me because I had a Vienna address at the time. And she was intrigued with a Vienna address that she didn't know. So I worked with AMV until, actually it was with AMV and its successor with Frederick R. Harris. I stayed with them for 10 years. And then I went to ICF here in Virginia, was there 10 years. Now I spend my time retired. I spend my time between Florida, 6 months in Florida. And yes, I had no damage. And here, and then I spend a lot of time looking at grandkids. They're into sports big time, so I spend my time going around the country and watching them do what they do and enjoying every minute of it.
I'm Marilyn Johnson. I was hired in 1971 to work in the accounting department part-time. Mary Gannett hired me. Thank you, Mary. And I was taking courses at Nova in computers and programming, and courtesy of Wayne, he got a position created as IT person that they didn't have at Voorhees. And I hung around till I got married in 1989 and moved to Rockville. And then I begged Phil Tarnoff to hire me, and he finally did. So now I've been retired for 15 years, and I'm living the good life, playing lots of tennis, playing lots of ping pong, working out, staying in shape. And my husband and I like to travel, so we have tried to do at least one big trip a year.
I'm Joe Mara. I worked at Voorhees for about 8 years, from 1970 to 1978. And then after that, I worked with some of the Voorhees spin-offs, Sal Valomo, Dick Keller, John Taylor. Then about 25 years ago, I've started my own, and actually I'm still working. I'm still doing my consulting, working with mostly state and local governments, and also some private developments. Hopefully, maybe for the next year or two.
This is Roy Sumner. I first had contact with the Voorhees organizations back in 1980 when I joined Martin and Voorhees after leaving the Road Research Laboratory in the UK. So my first real work was with MVA, and I was in Hong Kong with Brian Martin working on the various tram projects that we had there, and Al Voorhees used to visit from time to time, and after that project was over in the 80s, I left, and they moved me to, after a short stay in London, they moved me to the McLean office, where I worked with Dave Hill and Steve Shapiro and a bunch of others, and eventually worked along with John Flora on the projects that we had in Mumbai. Back then, of course, it was Bombay. After that was John left, and I took over the Bombay work and continued there until Phil Tarnoff left and founded Faradyne, and joined him, and we went off and did quite a lot of work and were successful until we were sold out to PB, Parsons Brinckerhoff. And I stayed with them as Phil had later left, and in the maybe the early 80s, I think it was, when Parsons Brinckerhoff eventually sold PB Faradyne to Telvent, I left and founded a new company called Free Ahead, and Dave Hill joined me there along with Robert Tolson, and we're still in business, and although I'm winding down now, as is Dave, and Dave has moved to Phoenix Tucson, Arizona. Rob Tolson is still with me, and Freer had spun off another company called Freer Head Services, which is providing manpower to VDOT, and that's working quite well. And this is where I am at the moment. Probably 99% retired. But if there's anything really interesting and really good, don't hesitate to give me a call. Thanks, Lynn.
I'm John Flora. I joined Voorhees in 1978 when they couldn't find anybody else to go to Bombay. I worked in operations under Don Capel, spent a lot of time in India, Argentina, and England, and teaching courses across the United States. I left Voorhees, or I guess it was PRC, in 1982 and joined the World Bank. I stayed there for about 22 years, working in the transport and urban development sectors in various parts of the world. After retiring at the end of 2003, I worked part-time for about 7 years as a technical advisor to a trust fund created by several European governments. This program was designed to facilitate private investment in infrastructure in the world's least developed countries. And it was probably the most interesting part of my career overall. It combined the relative strengths of the public and the private sectors to develop and operate infrastructure projects. And these range from water supply, ferry operations, to agricultural co-ops, and to methane extraction to keep a lake from exploding in Africa. I fully retired in 2011, currently live on a small piece of land at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains near Round Hill, Virginia. It's about 25 miles due west of Dulles Airport.
Well, I can start off in about the how I happened to leave AMV. It was a tough decision, and at the time, the PRC, or our owners, were PRC Harris or whatever they're called at the time, was deciding to consolidate some of the companies, and Walt, my colleague Walt Hansen, had decided to go to corporate with them, the corporate headquarters, and they wanted me to take over some combination of what was left of AMB plus the airport group and one of the economics groups, and maybe even some others. So it was a tough decision, but I made the right decision in going to TRB. I mean, over to CRB as executive director, and worked there for 14 years. One of my smartest moves was the recruitment of Bob Skinner over to come, and he ultimately succeeded me then at TRB when I retired in I guess it was 1994 that I retired as executive director. And thereafter was busy doing a lot more than I thought I was going to do. One of the things was I was chairman of the planning committee for the ITS America, and Congress had passed a law that an appropriation of $1 billion to ITS if we could get a strategic plan that was agreed to by both the private sector and the public sector. And as chairman of the planning committee, I was to pull that plan together, and that turned out to be a much more strenuous effort than I thought, but we finally got it done, and the public sector got the $1 billion to go ahead and work on ITS. After that, I was co-chairman of a committee established by the Maryland legislature, asking for recommendations concerning the maglev project that had been on the docket between Washington and Baltimore, and the feds were about to approve Maryland as application as being one of the applicants who was going to receive a grant, several $100 million to move ahead with the first leg of this maglev project. And the Maryland legislature got concerned that to do that, they were going to have to match those funds with Maryland state funds, and it was all something they really wanted until they got close to where they were going to have to come up with state monies of $500 million, and so the legislature established this committee and asked me to co-chair it. And so that was another project that I did. Then a couple of years later, the Maryland governor at the time appointed me as chairman of an investigating committee looking into construction failures on the rehabilitation of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. And that got me into a lot more physical engineering that I had been used to, but it turned out to be a very interesting project, and we made our recommendations and changed entirely how they were going about making those rehabilitations of the deck. A couple of years later, the governor appointed me as chairman of a group looking into the feasibility of moving ahead on a tollway, the so-called Intercounty Connector, a $12 billion freeway stretching from one side of Montgomery County over to Prince George's County in the northern suburbs of Washington, D.C. And we made recommendations there, including the establishment of variable tolls, of a network of variable tolls on the Maryland and Virginia beltways and a number of the other major radio freeways. And that is now happening, including the Intercounty Connector is now built as a variable toll road. And Virginia has put in the variable toll hot lanes on their section of the beltway. And hopefully there will be other pieces of it go into place in later years. Then a couple of years later, I was asked to be vice chairman of a National Research Council committee recommending ways to transport tons of lethal, highly radioactive waste from scores of nuclear power plants around the country to a geologic repository at Yucca Mountain, Nevada. That turned out to be one of the most controversial things I've ever gotten into, anything to do with radioactivity and transportation of nuclear waste by railroads or highways through populated areas scares people, and yet we've got to somehow get that stuff moved. So that was a very interesting project. And then there was a crash of an 18-wheeler that went through a guardrail on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge a few years later. And I was asked to chair, but I ended up just being a member of the investigative committee looking into that crash because of the problem that they found when they knocked the guardrail, when the truck knocked the guardrail into the bay, they got to examining what was left in lots of corrosion in the reinforcing steel that attached the guardrail to the deck. And that made everybody nervous that the whole bridge hadn't been inspected properly, and we got into a major project looking at the whole inspection processes used by the Maryland Department of Transportation in their tolls and their tunnels and bridges, major bridges around the state. And then currently I'm working on a congressionally required committee studying the need for protection of safety data, evidentiary protection in tort trials of safety data collected by transit agencies from being used in lawsuits against the agencies. And that is just now, the report is currently being written by the committee. And I also served somewhere during that stretch on a National Research Committee, Council committee made up of Academy of Sciences and Academy of Engineering, Academy of Medicine people recommending reorganization of the National Research Council, of which TRB is a part. So I've been pretty busy, not near as busy now as I used to be, but I probably did as much more fun and more significant work after I retired than before I was retired.
Hello, good morning. I'm Nancy Voorhees, and I have a photograph here of Dad in 1968 in front of his 3-story office building in Westgate Research Park, and the sign that he made. He made this sign in our home workshop with his jigsaw and a piece of plywood, and he spray painted it bronze. And I think it's a great looking design and that would hold up today. And but I think the key reason I wanted to bring this photo was that while Dad made the sign, the people at this reunion made AMV. And he and Mom would be just so thrilled to see all of you here. Mom would be impressed with how many people came, showed up, and Dad would just be looking for ideas and innovations to come out of the conversations today. My son was recruited by the University of Southern California for the men's swim team out of high school. And in his sophomore year, he called me up. We hadn't really thought about a major. All we were thinking about was college athletics. But he called me up his sophomore year and said he had selected his major. And he said it was urban planning. And I was surprised, thrilled, and knew he'd made a terrific choice. I became interested in the topics Kevin brought home to the family holiday dinner table. He was talking about urban freight, dynamic parking, and professors who were really so important in these fields that he was working with and doing research for. He was very excited about the field. And I credit Kevin's interest in sparking my own. I've become interested in these topics and as a field of study, and also as a way of connecting to my late father in this new way, understanding his profession and his development of applying models to the study of urban travel for people, and now seeing the challenge in understanding the urban goods movement, which is becoming so complex every day. So it's very interesting also to me that Dad was studying the B2B e-commerce in the very late 1990s and early 2000s. And I don't know that he probably thought about it, but I don't know if he understood the implications that the B2B e-commerce would have in urban freight. So it's just a wonderful day to meet with you all again and see the connection in Dad's profession, in my family now with my son, and me getting involved in these very important topics. So thank you for coming, and best to you.